Good afternoon, everyone. This is Carol Scott with the National Ombudsman Resource Center. I want to thank you for joining us today to learn about trauma-informed care. The purpose of this webinar is to introduce trauma-informed care to assist Ombudsman programs in understanding the responsibilities of nursing homes per the revised federal requirements and advocating for individualized care, including trauma-informed care. Ensuring that residents who are trauma survivors receive culturally competent, trauma-informed care is just one of several new federal requirements which will go into effect when Phase 3 of the revised federal nursing home regulations are implemented this coming November 28th. According to the National Council for Behavioral Health, 70% of adults have experienced some kind of traumatic event at least once in their lives. With that level of prevalence, it may be assumed that many residents have experienced trauma in their lives and may have lasting impacts of that trauma that would impact their care needs. Therefore, it is important to understand what trauma-informed care is and how it applies to long-term care residents and Ombudsman program advocacy. If you're having difficulty hearing this presentation, feel free to use your phone instead of your computer. And during today's webinar, you are welcome to use the chat feature, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. There's the toolkit and there's a chat feature, and you can type in any notes. Be sure that you are sending it to everyone, or if it's something you want just the presenters and hosts to know, you can change the "to" that's here in this red box on the right-hand side. There's also a Q&A feature. If you have a question for one of the speakers, please use the Q&A box, and we will respond to those questions at the end of the webinar today. So I want to thank Nancy and Patricia for joining us today. Nancy is an assistant professor in the Baccalaureate Social Work program at the University of Maryland. She will review the basics of trauma-informed care, the new federal requirement, how trauma-informed care relates to resident-centered care, and what this means for Ombudsman program advocacy and communication. Also joining us on the webinar today is Patricia Hunter. Patricia is the Washington State Long-Term Care Ombudsman and has been in that position since 2011. Patricia will share recent work of the Washington Ombudsman Program regarding trauma-informed care. And also joining us will be Douglas Samuels during the Q&A question period. Douglas is responsible for running their current program. Now I'd like to turn the webinar over to Dr. Casimel.
Thank you, Carol. I'm working on sharing my screen, and so in a moment you should all see the PowerPoint. What I'm going to be talking about today really is Trauma-Informed Care 101, what the basics are, what this might look like in a nursing home setting, and what this really means for Ombudsman and person-centered care. The one caveat I will give you is that what I'm presenting is not specifically what CMS will require. The interpretive guidelines are not yet out. So this is more of an overview. And as the interpretive guidelines come out, more and more information will become available about what specifically it will be that nursing homes will need to do to be compliant. So as I said, as Carol said, and as I said, we'll talk about trauma-informed care. We'll talk about what language is in the federal requirement and what this looks like and what this means for Ombudsman. I have a couple of cases embedded in this that we'll use to really talk about how this can be applied. So I'm going to start with the definition. Trauma-informed care is an organizational culture that recognizes that everyone who interacts with an agency, in this case a nursing home, may have a past traumatic experience that we may or may not know about. Now that's a lot of jargony mumbo jumbo. What does that really mean? That means that organizational culture is the way we do things around here. It can mean what the policies and procedures of that nursing home are, and to what the what people just do in the course of doing business in that space. I think of trauma-informed care like universal precautions. So universal precautions being that way we wear gloves if we're going to be touching body fluids and things like that. A trauma-informed organization treats everyone as if they might have had some trauma that we don't know about. And what does that mean? Or what does the okay, let's start with what the regulations say. So to quote directly from that final rule, trauma survivors, including veterans, survivors of large-scale natural and human-caused disasters, Holocaust survivors, and survivors of abuse are among those who may be residents of long-term care facilities. And for these individuals, the utilization of trauma-informed approaches is an essential part of person-centered care. I believe that that definition is a good start. I think it names some very important groups that are in fact residents of nursing homes, but I think that, well, if we're being truly trauma-informed, we have to think about the fact that everyone might have had some experience that may be one of these experiences, but maybe other types of trauma as well. And from a regulatory perspective, providers are referred to a SAMHSA booklet that is available online called Concept of Trauma Guidance for a Trauma-Informed Approach. If you look way at the end of my slides, there is a link to this brochure which gives you some really concrete kinds of ways that facilities and organizations can think about what trauma-informed care looks like in their organization. That means that for every resident, nursing homes should think about residents' past traumatic experiences to best care for them. What that means for every nursing home is going to be different. Some nursing homes may decide to include a trauma assessment in their admissions assessment. Others may include it when they do their MDS evaluations. Others may just ask a question or two as part of other assessments and information that they're gathering from residents. And some of that will depend on what that nursing home's capacity is. If they have an extensive mental health program, if they have access to psychiatry, they may wish to go further into this than another nursing home with fewer resources in that area. Trauma-informed care is not trauma treatment. It can include trauma treatment, but it's not necessarily one and the same. As I said in the CMS definition, CMS specifically asks us to look at veterans, disaster survivors, Holocaust survivors, and survivors of abuse. That doesn't necessarily mean things that happened before they came to the nursing home. So if we think about survivors of natural disasters, we've seen in the last several hurricanes and things like that, nursing home residents who were in flooding. We, as ombudsmen, are all aware of cases of abuse that happen in nursing homes. So we also have to think about the ways that people might experience new traumas in a nursing home and how being trauma informed can combat against those experiences. The DSM-5 defines trauma as any experience that threatened death or physical harm. And we also have to think about, in our nursing home residents, serious illnesses. So what may or may not have happened to them along the course of the way of getting there. You know, hospitalizations, ICU care, things like that. Forced displacement, and I use that term carefully, but the idea that somebody might not have come into the nursing home completely of their own volition. They may have felt like they had no other choice. Losing their spouse, losing their home, losing their independence. And in addition, some of the trauma definitions look at not just experiencing these things directly, but witnessing these types of things happening to other people. So when we're thinking about somebody's history, and remember, a lot of our residents are of advanced ages, have experienced a lot of things over the course of their lives. And so what have they witnessed over the course of their lives as well? SAMHSA, in that brochure I referred you to, uses a framework called the Event Experience Effect Framework, the 3 E's. And so what the 3 E's do is they also tell us that not everyone who experiences trauma has an adverse effect from it. Everyone experiences it in a different way. That's how you get, you know, 2 siblings who maybe grew up in the same household where abuse was going on, coming out with very different outcomes. So the event is simply what happened. We have a whole list of events that could be potentially traumatic, including those that threaten physical or psychological harm or neglect. Also keeping in mind that these are things that might happen once, might happen kind of episodically, or when they're around a certain person or things like that, or just repeatedly over time, never knowing when the next time something is going to happen. And how the individual experiences it. Some of that is kind of where they were in their life at that point, how old they were, and how they interpret the event. And all of that will really be that individual personality traits kinds of things that affect how somebody experiences what we would consider a trauma. And then what was the effect? Did somebody have an adverse effect? So when we think of adverse effects of trauma, often we go to something like post-traumatic stress disorder. And I want to emphasize that that is not the only adverse effect that can happen, but it is certainly one of the effects that is often part of this discourse. And adverse effects can happen right away, or may have a more delayed onset. So somebody who might have been coping with a trauma just fine when they were living in the community and now are in a nursing home and don't have access to, can't control their own environment, don't have access to some of the coping things they've been doing over time, may now have an adverse effect where they didn't before. So what do I want you to take away from what I've said so far? There are a lot of things that can be traumatic that happen over the course of life. Not everyone who experiences a traumatic effect has a negative impact. Negative impacts can be seen long after the event. And, 2 people that experience the same event may have very different outcomes. That's why trauma-informed care is really about person-centered care. So it's recognizing what trauma might have caused and responding to that individual's needs. So I'm going to give you two frameworks of what trauma-informed care is. One is that SAMHSA framework, and those are the items that are in red on the slide here. And the other framework is by authors named Fallett and Harris, whose frameworks came out in 2009. And a lot of the early trauma-informed care work used this Fallett and Harris framework. And what these principles are what trauma-informed care should include. So Fallett and Harris say trauma-informed care includes approaches that emphasize safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. SAMHSA also includes that safety piece. SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Association, or agency, the government office who has created a lot of materials on this. They include, like I said, that safety, trustworthiness, and transparency. They don't include choice, but they do include peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. Again, lots of jargon, lots of words. I want to talk to you about what that actually means and what that looks like on the ground. In thinking about those principles, traumatic experiences are often about situations that somebody lacks control of, and the principles are about restoring that control and not repeating that lack of control through organizational practices. And when we think about nursing homes, when we think about these environments that we're talking about, we take away a lot of power, a lot of choice, sometimes mobility. So thinking about, don't get up, you might fall, kind of approach that often happens in nursing homes, that's taking away control, that's taking away autonomy. And end-of-life experiences in particular can be particularly triggering when we think about the fact that we go back to our definition of trauma. Our definition is about events that threaten physical safety, physical health. That's what end of life is all about, and that's a lot of what we see in long-term care. We also have to think about our nursing home residents. We have to think about the older adults that we're taking care of. The attitudes, the upbringings, the messages that they received across their life may mean that there is unaddressed trauma. So we're looking right now at a generation that had attitudes like take it like a man, or in cases of domestic violence, instead of thinking about divorce or getting out, you made your bed, now lie in it. And so these are attitudes that may have led towards hiding past trauma, shame, stoicism, so not dealing with traumas at the time that they occurred. As I said, also for our older adults, they've experienced a lot of changes to come to the nursing home. And so things that they used to cope with these things earlier, controlling their environment, who they let into their house, things like that, has now all been upended. And so now they're trying to adjust to those traumas, control their environments in a place that's totally different, that they don't have those same kinds of controls over the things that they can, people coming into their spaces, and all of those things that we take for granted in our own homes that are not the case in long-term care. When we think about safety, we have to think about both physical and emotional safety. And often in long-term care, now I didn't say this in my introduction, but I was a nursing home social worker for a long time before I came into being a professor. And so how often do we sacrifice emotional safety for physical safety? No, you can't get up. No, you can't walk by yourself. No, because we're trying to keep you physically safe. And yet that could make someone feel very trapped. And we really have to work on finding a balance between that physical and emotional safety. Trustworthiness and transparency is thinking about follow through, doing what you say you're going to do. So you, as an ombudsman, doing what you say you're going to do, if you're going to follow up on something, if you're going to share some information, and do the nursing homes. Are they transparent? Do they tell residents what they're going to do? Do they do what they say they're going to do? With choice in nursing homes is interesting because choice, we often think about choice in terms of things like the food or, well, we let them choose what they're going to wear today, but do they have genuine choices about programs to attend, services to accept, where to receive the services? I was doing some research in a continuing care community, and one of the participants said to me, yeah, we say they have choices and they have this great menu here and more choices than maybe they have somewhere else, but that's still choice within a limited option. We could stop at 15 different places on our way to work and decide what we're going to eat, and they just don't have that. And so when we think about choice, we're thinking about it in the context of a limited environment. If we go over to that SAMHSA principle of peer support, what are the places and opportunities for residents to really interact with others with similar interests and similar experiences? I'm not saying that the nursing home has to have a trauma support group or something like that, but are there ways for residents to really get together around shared experiences, even if it's just the shared experiences of living in a long-term care facility? Collaboration and mutuality. Are you working together with residents on common goals? And do the residents believe that? We're not all therapists, we're not all social workers, and we don't have to be. You don't have to be in a therapeutic role to be collaborative with a resident. When I worked in long-term care, I had a family who the family member died, and I went in to provide comfort, and they didn't want me to, they were looking for the housekeeper because they had been with the housekeeper every evening and would talk to her, and they were looking for her at their time of loss to come together and pray and things like that. And so who are all the people in the environment that residents feel mutuality with, who they can be collaborative with in living their life? Empowerment, or empowerment voice and choice. How do you recognize, you as an ombudsman, the strength and the skills of the residents that you interact with? As an ombudsman, how do you help the residents have a voice? I know it's easy to be the voice of the resident, but how do you help the residents have a voice themselves? And the final principle, cultural, historical, and gender issues, is large and complex. Hardly seems like I can give it justice on just one slide. And so thinking about the ways organizations, nursing homes, ombudsman programs actively move past stereotypes and biases, thinking about the specific racial, cultural, and ethnic needs of residents, Thinking about historical trauma, and I'll get to that one in a minute when I talk about Holocaust survivors. But thinking about this issue very broadly. So I'm going to share a brief infographic that looks at the Fallon-Harris model, but gives some examples within those definitions of what they can look like in practice. Maintaining professional boundaries, allowing residents to feel validated and affirmed every time they contact at the agency. So with every person that they interact with in the nursing home, and things like that. So when we talk about trauma-informed care as organizational culture, we're talking about everyone who interacts with the environment. So yes, being trauma-informed with the residents is our primary goal. But in order to be trauma-informed with the residents, we need to think about being trauma-informed with everyone. So if you think about your CNAs, your GNAs, whatever that looks like in your state, do those direct care staff members feel safe? Do they feel safe enough to make suggestions about care, report problems, bring things to your attention as an ombudsman? Do they feel safe enough to interact with you as an ombudsman? Or do they feel like they're maybe being watched or maybe not feeling safe in that environment? Is the care planning process collaborative? Does it include all levels of staff, the resident, the family, in all kinds of different ways as they're providing care? And thinking about the families in this trauma-informed way. What is the level of trust that the families have in the staff, in you, in the resident experience? Often when families are interacting with Ombudsman, it's because they don't have that trust in the facility. And so how can you work with a family to increase their feelings of safety, their belief that the staff will provide the care that their family member needs? And again, that choice question, are the residents and their families offered choices in how and where and when different kinds of services are provided? So now I'm going to switch over to a case study. Now this case is a fake patient that I've invented along with my co-author, Keith Anderson, but it's based on any number of residents that we've encountered over the years. So I'm going to be talking about Lucia. She's 72. She recently came into the nursing home. She's a college degree. She worked up until fairly recently. Her daughter lives out of state, and she's in this nursing home because her son is here in our community. She recently lost her husband. She has congestive heart failure, osteoporosis. She recently got diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And she's coming into the nursing home because she fell and broke her hip. And despite physical therapy, she's just not able to get independent to come back home. When she was admitted, her son said she's not been the same since her husband died. And, her son is her healthcare proxy, her power of attorney. He's started to make a lot of the decisions for her. He was afraid for her safety when she was home by herself. And even though she was nominally involved in the decision to come into the nursing home, she really felt like she had no choice, because between her care needs and her son's work schedule, she didn't feel like she had any other option. And like many of our long-term care residents, she will be living in a room with a roommate. And so as we talk about this case, and I know that there's not a lot of back and forth in a webinar kind of format, but I want you to be thinking about what recent events that she's experienced, and then also what past experiences do we have no idea about. So let's even start with just those recent experiences. What are those things that in somebody maybe who's younger, maybe who's not in a long-term care facility, would we look at and think of as potentially traumatic events?
So Nancy, this is Carol. If
Yes.
people would like to be responding as you're talking, they can use the chat function and be typing in, even if they're all getting the same answers. Feel free to use that chat to answer some of the questions that Nancy's asking.
And Carol, if you could be reading those to me, that would be helpful since I can't see the chat while I'm projecting my screen.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Loss of independence, broken hip, losing your husband, moving to a nursing home is traumatic. And that's it for now.
Okay, and then those are some of the things that I was going to suggest here. That recent loss of mobility, just the ability to get up out of your chair and go to the bathroom by yourself, can be a pretty traumatic event. That recent loss of her husband. So if we think about people coming into a nursing home, how many times on the admission assessment do we check off widow and just assume that she's widowed and along the whole pool of other widows that you've got in the nursing home, but really have no idea that really it was just less than a year ago that she lost her husband. That loss of her home, her independence, this new diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Again, maybe somebody coming in and Alzheimer's disease gets added to that long list of diagnoses that somebody has, and we don't think about, wow, this was just a recent diagnosis, and what does that mean for me moving forward? That fall with injury. She fell and broke her hip. We have no idea where she fell, how long she laid on the floor before somebody found her, and what was involved in her hospital stay or whether it was surgically repaired and all of those kinds of things. And that limited control over the move to the nursing home. Yes, it makes sense. Yes, we want her to have care. Yes, she needs a more supportive environment. But what does that really mean for her when she really felt like she had no other choice? And this is just the recent stuff. This is just the stuff that we might know from an admission assessment. But we don't know anything about the past. We don't know whether she's had to move unexpectedly before. We don't know whether she's had other injuries that she's recovered from. We don't know what other losses of family members she has had in her past and what this could mean for her now. I'm going to speak for a couple of slides about Holocaust survivors specifically because the regulations do specifically address that Holocaust survivor. So when we think about Lucia in the context of a Holocaust survivor or other Holocaust survivors who've maybe experienced similar things, specific triggers for Holocaust survivors may include things like showers, uniforms, loud noises, and really any ways that we might restrict food, clothing, shelter, and not to say this won't affect other people who are not Holocaust survivors, but these are particular things that may be particularly important in those cases. And for Holocaust survivors, even simple things like a social history, which is kind of a standard part of our standard assessment, can be re-traumatizing because Holocaust survivors may have lost multiple family and friends in the concentration camps or in the post-war era, or be separated from them because of things that happened after the war. So things that we look at and think of as just a routine part of that admission process is may be very upsetting to them. And so how is it that we can make somebody feel safe? How can we make something like a social service assessment less distressing when we won't know that they're a Holocaust survivor until we do that social service assessment? What are the aspects of making somebody like Lucia feel safe, and then taking it further, somebody who may be a survivor of trauma feel safe? Are we worried about physical safety? do we think about emotional safety in that context, or are we so focused on that physical safety that we haven't thought about it in that greater collective? What does it mean to have a roommate and feel safe? And I'm giving you a lot of questions and not a lot of answers. And I think that's that person-centered piece, because what that means is going to be different for every individual.
Nancy, one person has mentioned that smells alone could be a biggie.
Absolutely. And so how do you address that in that collective environment? How do you, if noises, like I said in the Holocaust survivor slide, if noises are triggering, how do you deal with that resident with dementia who's screaming every day at 4 o'clock? What does that do for other residents who are potentially seriously affected by that? When we think about trustworthiness, how much more vulnerable is somebody with recent losses if somebody doesn't follow through? If somebody does something that they can't understand? That's the other part of, as a provider, you might have, admitted somebody to a nursing home 1,000 times, but for this resident and this family, this is their first encounter with a nursing home admission. So they don't know what to expect, even if you do. And I think as Ombudsman, it's important to help with that education, help with teaching people what to expect, what's going to come next. What is routine and what can they expect versus this is something we need to address. That choice. How do nursing facilities promote choice? And then how can Ombudsman help to promote choice? I think Ombudsmen have sort of that dual role where they can promote choice within the nursing home, work with residents to find out what they want, and help work with the nursing homes to give them those kinds of choices, but then also in their own advocacy work, promoting choice in, what do you want to do about this situation? We can do this or we can do that, and which do you want to do? Instead of just saying, well, this is the solution to that problem.
And Nancy, one person just wrote in that certain words and tones of voice can be a trigger.
Absolutely. I think collaboration is a big one where Ombudsman can get involved because collaboration is about bringing her perspective, her family's perspective, and the facility's perspective all together. And I think this very much fits the role of the Ombudsman in terms of being that liaison and bringing people together and helping to get everybody on the same page. What if she and her son disagree about ambulation, about a choice that she wants to make about control over her life? The son may say, well, but you came in here to be safe. So no, I don't want you, walking around. I keep going back to ambulation because in my practice, that was where I saw a lot of those kinds of conflicts where a resident would want to continue to walk even if it was a risk for them, and their children were more concerned that they would fall again or break a hip again and things like that. But I think the same can be said for food and medications and other things like that, where residents and families may disagree on the best course of action. Empowerment, again, about helping to make sure she retains as much control over her life as possible. And if the Ombudsman's involved, getting what kind of control can she have over that interaction? How can she work with the Ombudsman to advocate for her wants and whatever changes need to take place? And very, very broadly, again, with the cultural, historical, and gender issues, we could have a whole webinar just on this principle alone. So thinking about culturally specific considerations that we need to make, and ways that facilities can be welcoming to those in non-majority cultures. So I was giving I'm here in Baltimore, and I was giving a training in Washington, D.C. And I said to the staff, you know, we're in DC. How many different cuisines, for example, can we eat in a 10-mile radius of where we're sitting? And they were giving me all kinds of answers of how many different cuisines we could have. And I said, okay, now how many of those are on your facility menu? And you could hear the silence. And so thinking about all of the ways that non-majority cultures can be welcomed into a facility, from the menu to the availability of religious services to other ways that oppression can be proliferated, and how we can combat those in our daily care. So how do we fix this? How do we make sure that we're being trauma informed? How do we make sure that facilities are being trauma informed? As I said, the interpretive guidelines from CMS are not out yet, and so we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. But I believe that trauma-informed care is not a destination, it's a journey, and that every day everyone can be more trauma-informed than they were the day before. And that true trauma-informed care is an organizational commitment that and that all staff needs to be on board. So when you walk into a facility as an ombudsman, who greets you? What is their experience? And do they greet new residents? And how do they greet new residents? Do they just get told that they're heading down to room whatever and head on down there? Or does somebody truly welcome them? And how does the staff get received and welcomed as well? I think small. And that sounds counterintuitive when I'm talking about an organizational culture, but what small changes in the nursing homes that you visit can they make that would move them in this direction? Think about how the environment's policies, practices do not inadvertently re-traumatize people. What, as an individual, what can you do to increase choice, be more trustworthy, be more transparent, promote choice, collaborate with residents, and practice in a culturally informed way? And I challenge you individually as ombudsman to think about your own practice, and then also to think about the facilities that you go to. What are they doing that is good? What are they doing that does promote these principles? And what are simple things they can do to be a little bit better? Again, as I said, what can they do better tomorrow than they did today that would make them a little bit more trauma-informed? And since trauma-informed care is a person-centered care, you as the ombudsman can help them get to know the person and what does that individual need for you to be trauma-informed for them. I know that the slides are being shared in the chat feature, and I encourage you to download them because there are now 3 slides of web-based, publicly available kinds of resources that will allow you to think about this in different ways. There's 2 podcasts that I have up currently on the screen that I've done with the University of Buffalo School of Social Work podcast series that just give you some more things to think about in providing trauma-informed care and just trauma in later life and what that means. I think sometimes we fall into the trap that older adults can't change, they can't deal with their trauma, there is no growth. And I will challenge that and say that people can cope, people can heal from past trauma in later life. And so thinking about the ways that can happen. If facilities are looking for resources, there's more and more stuff coming out every day about how to implement trauma-informed care. I'll refer you first to the SAMHSA materials because those are the ones referenced in the guidelines. But there are also other trauma-informed care change manuals, trauma-informed processes that are out there. And so I've just cited a couple of them, knowing that there's a lot more that is out there. And then some more information about trauma in general. So I didn't talk about the ACEs study, but the ACEs study took place in the late 1990s and looked at adverse childhood experiences. That's what the acronym ACE stands for. And that is certainly where we've talked a lot about trauma in this country. And I think for older adults, it's important that we don't stop simply at those adverse childhood experiences, because we're talking about trauma that might have happened across a lifetime and not just in childhood. And I'm going to leave you with my contact information. Please feel free to reach out with specific questions, specific thoughts that you have about what you see out in the community as you look at trauma-informed care. I'm going to turn it over to the next presenter at this point, but I'll be here and available for questions as we move forward.
Great, Nancy, thank you so much. And we do have some comments and questions that we will get to before the end of this. So Patricia, if you'll get ready, and I will tell people that just as Nancy mentioned, the PowerPoint slides are in, link to them are in the chat section. A copy of this recording and the PowerPoint will be on the long-term or ltcombudsman.org, ltc.ombudsman.org website, and each of you will receive an email with the recording link and information on how to get to the website. So Patricia, if you will take it over. After you unmute yourself.
There we go. Okay, hi everyone. So, you know, it's always really affirming hearing someone like Dr. Cozumel sort of affirm some of the things that you've done in a project. So thank you, Nancy, so much for your presentation. It was very informative, and you've given me some resources that I want to look into myself. So I'm going to be talking about the Washington State Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program Victims of Crime Project. The short name for that we call VOCA, Victims of Crime Assistance. And although I know that there are providers on the line, you know, this is geared towards ombudsman, I do think that there are definitely resources, and many of the examples that I'll share here, I think affirm what Dr. Cozumel was talking about, that you can do in your own organization, whether it be a nursing home or a social service agency or an ombudsman program. To start, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of how we got to where we are with this VOCA funded project. And on this screen, you can see sort of the nuts and bolts of the project, which ends at the end of this month. But I do want to emphasize that this was not an overnight decision for us. As Nancy was talking about, this was a compilation of several years, about 5 years of work that we've been doing with our state protection and advocacy organization known as Disability Rights Washington. They were the lead grantee and grant coordinator of a Department of Justice grant on from the Office of Violence Against Women. And the other key partner in the grant was our state education and technical support provider known as WCSAP, the Washington Coalition for Sexual Assault Programs. So over the last 5 to 6 years, we've taken a deep dive into looking into our own organizational frameworks, our individual organizational competencies and weaknesses, our culture, and then also our policies and procedures when it came to trauma-informed practice and working with individuals who experienced violence. So it was a deep dive, and we weren't allowed to provide any direct services to long-term care residents or to others, but more really just focus internally as to how we did our work and what we needed to change. So that set the stage for the timing of when this VOCA RFP, the request for proposal, was released by our state office, State VOCA office. But one of the questions that had been nagging me for 7 or 8 years as state ombudsman was oftentimes, not often, but occasionally we would get complaints from particularly nursing homes and providers that our ombudsmen were coming into facilities and unintentionally upsetting residents. And, I had obviously all kinds of really good explanations for that. But one thing that bothered me was, were the ombudsman unintentionally triggering trauma in long-term care residents? I mean, dealing with a complaint issue alone can be traumatic, but were we sort of stepping into an environment of trauma and not really recognizing it and not really dealing with that? I'm sure this has happened for those of you who are ombudsmen. I'm sure this has happened to you as well. So through our work with this partnership, it really became clearer and clearer to me that long-term care ombudsman work really is trauma-informed work. I mean, when Nancy laid out all the sort of the principles and the questions of what trauma-informed practice looks like, being person-centered, allowing for self-advocacy and choice and independence, it just, to me, just meshed perfectly with our work. So it made sense to move forward with applying in this grant. Here on this slide, it talks about the victims of crime definition that was in this VOCA application. And I want to share this with you because I think it just really broadens our understanding of who is a victim and what exactly is meant by crime. I mean, that was a concern when we applied for this funding. We knew certainly that long-term care residents could be victims of neglect, abuse, violence, and exploitation. But actually, we rarely saw criminal charges filed, let alone someone or some entity being held accountable outside of the licensing framework. So using the terms, victim of crime just isn't not the typical language that we use in long-term care ombudsman work or in long-term care. So the Victims of Crime grant defined victims of crime as the following: any physical, financial, or emotional harm that does not fall into descriptions of domestic violence or sexual assault. Okay, that's fine. And for the purpose of the grant, the term victim, although it's often used, the intent was to indicate any individual who identifies that they have suffered physical, financial, or emotional harm. So that really just broadened things for us in terms of who could be served. And then tackling the term crime, for this grant, participation or involvement with the justice system was not a requirement. And that really opened the door in terms of allowing us to access VOCA services and VOCA funding to help long-term care residents. The very last bullet point regarding individuals who are harmed or hurt, not identifying with terminology such as victim of crime or survivor, that was a definite given for us, and we understood that possibly a real challenge for us as well. So how do you serve individuals who don't see themselves as necessarily being victims of crime or a survivor of harm? This is the last definition that was really the aha moment for me. So we know individuals may not identify as victims, and consequently, some providers may not see themselves as victim service providers, even if they are in the daily practice of attending to people's trauma. For me, that sounds like ombudsman work, and I just have never thought of it from that perspective, that we are dealing on a daily basis with attending to people's trauma, to residents' experiences with trauma. And it could be recent traumas, the fact just coming to a long-term care facility can be traumatic, or it could be something, very old from childhood or or earlier in life. The other thing I was thinking as we were applying for this grant and doing this work is that, you know, all the laws, the resident right laws, we all emphasize the home-likeness, the home-like being important for the long-term care residents. The nursing home or assisted living facility is the resident's home. And, you know, home is a place, a feeling of comfort, independence, safety, and security. And as Nancy mentioned, it's a place that has a welcoming culture, one of respect and inclusion. But for me, you know, I asked myself, how does that really sync up with the fact that it is common for long-term care residents to come in their new living environments into facilities under traumatic circumstances, such as, you know, having a recent medical event or loss, significant personal losses, and having to make some very significant decisions for their future. So for me, Ombudsman, knowing about trauma-informed advocacy just would enhance the work in our complaint resolution work and also in our systems change work. So this definition just really resonated with me. So the nuts and bolts to the program, our goals, we certainly wanted Ombudsman to be able to recognize and identify signs of trauma as a result of this grant project. We wanted them to be aware of secondary trauma, particularly triggering trauma. We wanted them to know and connect with local victim support services for referral and collaboration. That important piece, right, in terms of building trust, is we wanted them to be able to follow up with residents who wanted to use VOCA services. And we wanted to have some kind of assistance set up where Ombudsman and consumers could give us feedback about our process. And also we wanted feedback about when they used the VOCA services, whether they were helpful or not. So I wanted just to note on the second bullet point on secondary trauma, a note that the secondary trauma, you know, it includes the residents that are in the facility. So you have the victim and then you have all the other people who are involved. And I just also want to note that it also includes the long-term care ombudsman themselves. It was really important to us to raise awareness internally to recognize that our own ombudsman may be triggered by the abuse, neglect, and exploitation stories that they were witnessing in their own work. So we spent the last 18 months creating trainings for ombudsmen. We focused on trauma, we focused on the grant mechanics, we also focused on the network of services that were available. We created an online training using the Prezi platform and developed written curricula. On our website, we added internal access pages only for Ombudsman. That's where we have our online training, and we placed materials as well as survey tools to track qualitatively and quantitatively how many people went through the online training and what they thought of it. So this is just a snapshot of one of our web pages on our website. This is a map of VOCA-funded services all across Washington State. The providers need to be able to serve young victims as well as elderly. And these are all funded through the state. These are certainly not all of the providers in Washington State that can provide trauma-informed services to victims of crime or victims of trauma. So I really do encourage everyone who's on this webinar to seek out your state Office of Crime Victims Assistance, because there is this entire network that exists in your state that you may not even be tapping into or be aware of. And then this is just a snapshot of the resources, some of the resources that we created that's on our public-facing page. Again, we have all the contacts and different service providers listed. And we also have bibliography. We'll be adding some more information given what Nancy gave to us today. So what was gained? We met our goals. We're still developing. We're still working on building relationships with local providers. And we're still working on creating information that will be helpful to ombudsmen in their practice. Two specific examples I wanted to give was in one situation, we had a complaint case where an adult family homeowner, that's a small living setting, suddenly shut down her facility, and she absconded with a resident's deposit. It was about $5,000. And the Ombudsman was able to access legal support services under the VOCA umbrella. The resident's POA was able to obtain legal advice, including help and encouragement to seek restitution through small claims court. And, you know, maybe for your state, that's something that's a given. Maybe in your community, that's a given. You would have known to do this. But for us in our state, that was new information to us and a new resource for us. Another example I want to share is an ombudsman was able to obtain counseling services for a long-term care resident who was suffering trauma due to a history of abuse. Currently, the resident has a skilled therapist visiting her in her assisted living facility. She was able to make accommodations to actually come to the resident versus sending the resident out by taxi or whatever other types of transportation she might need. That's a win for us in Washington State. I don't know about you, but getting mental health services for long-term care residents is definitely challenging. So although the project ends soon for us, it ends at the end of this month, I think that we're in a much better position than we were 18 months ago in understanding trauma and how it impacts the people that we serve, but also in understanding how it impacts us as ombudsmen, especially when we think about compassion fatigue and burnout. I think it's really important for us to have that here in our program for self-understanding and for ombudsman advocacy and mutual support. So again, we're not finished. We have more to learn. We have many more relationships to build, and we haven't figured out how we're going to do that now that the funding has ended, but I'm hopeful that what we've learned so far will be used well. So I am available for questions. I didn't get into the minutia of this grant and the work that we've done, but I'm definitely available in the future. If you want to contact me, here's my information.
Patricia, thank you. While I'm switching over, a question came in is whether the grant covered trauma related to rape.
You want to know whether the grant covered trauma related to rape?
Yes.
So in terms of one-to-one like treatment, so what it covered for us is referral and identification and follow-up. So we would refer the client to an appropriate direct provider. So for example, if it were to have happened here in King County, we would refer them to probably King County Sexual Assault Unit. And so they take it from there. So whether that be the actual rape kit examination, the nurse's examination, that kind of thing. For us, we wanted to be the liaison, the connector between this great network of services out in the community that exist and the long-term care residents.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You bet.
So a couple other things, and then we'll get to questions. So be sure and type your questions into the Q&A box. You know, in working to resolve a complaint, the long-term care ombudsman programs are required to provide person-centered support to residents. Well, the program provides the resident with as much control as possible over their own information, the plan of action to resolve the complaint, and the determination of whether the complaint has been resolved to the resident's satisfaction. The Ombudsman program's resident-centered advocacy approach and focus on individualized care fits well with ensuring that residents receive trauma-informed care. These are just a few listings here of things that Ombudsman programs should consider that may be events that cause trauma to residents, and both Nancy and Patricia have mentioned some of these, but you know, just moving from one facility to another. When a roommate dies, there may be an opportunity to have a conversation with a resident to make sure that that they are receiving services if they request them. And then to obviously connect residents with the resources and advocate for particular services, which is exactly what Patricia was mentioning in the Washington State program. And as we all know, we don't do anything without the residents' permission, so the complaints are confidential. We don't give out any kind of information unless we've been given permission to do that. Ombudsmen advocate for comprehensive care plans and individualized resident-centered care. We try to remind facilities of their responsibilities per the federal and state requirements. So that's why we felt that this topic is very timely, that all ombudsmen understand what the federal regulations, especially F699, that's the FTAG 699, talks about trauma-informed care. And as Nancy mentioned, there will be some more guidance coming from CMS, hopefully sometime this summer before this all goes into effect in November. I'm obviously sharing information about trauma-informed care with especially the residents and family members. It's not the ombudsman's responsibility to make sure that they, are following the regulations. But if ombudsman can understand what those regulations are and be aware of how certain activities or what kind of training is happening in a home, they might be able to just help them understand benefits like using consistent assignment and other ways that staff get to know residents that they are caring for. And of course, as both speakers mentioned, empowering the residents to speak up on their own behalf is a core function of the ombudsman. Some resources on the Consumer Voice website is a fillable form, personal directions for quality living. This might be a document that you would want to make available to staff and volunteers in the program, and see if any of the homes, you would only have to take one or two in and they can make their own copies of this, or you can give them the link and they could download it. But this is a great document for helping people fill out information about themselves that will help inform the home in how they might provide quality care. And then additional resources, the federal nursing home regulations, resident rights, resources for consumers, and then the Administration for Community Living's guidance to the Aging Services Network on provision of services to Holocaust survivors. Just a quick mention that, as hopefully all of you know, October of each year is Residents' Rights Month. And so this would be a great opportunity for you to begin now to start scheduling time to visit with resident and family councils or staff meetings and talk about consistent assignment, talk about resident empowerment, talk about maybe how to make choice real, and have them have the people that you're speaking with give those answers. As ombudsman, we don't have to have all the answers. We just need to make sure that there's an opportunity for people to speak up. So use October as an opportunity to educate and empower residents. So as far as questions, boy, how am I going to do this?
Carol, it's Nancy. I've been looking on the Q&A while we've been talking here, and there's a couple of questions that have come up that I'd like to address for the whole group, if that's
Perfect.
okay.
That's perfect.
Okay, so the first question comes from Anna, and Anna was wondering how the trauma-informed care is different than person-centered care or culture change or some of the other terms that we've used in nursing homes over the years. And I think that's a great question, because I think that when I first looked at it, I also had that question. I think the biggest difference is this underlying understanding of the long-term impacts of trauma. That being trauma-informed is being person-centered in some of those other ways that those other kinds of models look like, but it starts with this underlying understanding of people's experiences across their lifetime and the way those experiences may have impacted them long term. So sort of shifts the lens. So I hope that clarifies that. I think the other question that I want to address is somebody asked about assessment tools. And I think that's an individual question that facilities are going to need to answer for themselves. There are a lot of trauma assessment tools out there. And, you know, as part of the new regulations that this facility should be doing this individualized assessment to understand their own capacities and their own resident groups. And I think they need to look at that to make a decision about what kind of assessment is right for them. I think some of the resources that I've referred you to in the slides can give you more guidance about the different kinds of assessment tools that are out there, but the facilities are going to have to make an individual decision on what's going to work best for them and their population. So those are the ones I've looked at so far.
That was great, Nancy. I'm definitely not an expert on what CMS is going to expect, but back in my nursing home days, I do remember that, you know, social histories were part of the normal intake process, and that might be a point where there may be some clues or some information offered.
Thank you both. That's very, very good. So one person, and this kind of was addressed, but I'd love to have both of you think about this. Many residents of Houston facilities have recently experienced storm-related trauma. In turn, an ombudsman's role includes advocating for preparation for the next storm. How do we accomplish that aim while maintaining awareness that further talk about storms and flooding may trigger awful memories of trauma? So in other words, we're wanting to get people prepared, but sometimes in talking about preparation, we are inadvertently causing people to re-experience something.
I love that question. That's a great question. That's exactly how we need to be thinking about this. So kudos to whoever that is from Houston. I'd love to talk to you more about that. But it's hard because you do have to balance that preparedness with not re-traumatizing people. And I think it's important to spend time in that preparedness, assuring people about the things you're doing differently, assuring people about the ways that you're changing the ways you're going to make them safe in the future, and addressing the concerns and fears about what happened last time, whatever that is, but what happened last time. I think that's an important piece of that.
Yeah, I really like your answer, Nancy, particularly the second part. What could possibly be done to maybe bring a therapist in, or even a support group? You know, if you're in an area that experiences considerable natural disasters, maybe it might be appropriate for a support group. But I don't have, you know, the right answer, but I would start with what kind of choices can I offer this individual who finds this preparation to be triggering. And then finally, you know, as an ombudsman, I would say, how important is it for this individual to go through the training? As long as everyone else around them is trained and knows that this person might panic or freeze, how important is it really to put this person through a triggering event? Those are just my thoughts.
I agree. I also think that if people are from that area, their experience with these kinds of natural disasters might not just be in that long-term care facility. And so finding out more about what their experiences were, for example, in Katrina and in other past events before they even got to this setting.
Yeah, and this brings up the issue of, sometimes it's going to be the staff who have experienced trauma, or it's even possible that an ombudsman has experienced trauma. And so making sure that there is recognition of that, so that if you're going to have a trauma-informed environment, it needs to be aimed at everyone. Now, the ombudsman obviously, is going to be interested in making sure that the staff are not traumatized and are not acting out because of being traumatized. But again, that's where relationships and, looking to see, is it the kind of environment where, as you said, Nancy, can CNAs bring up issues? Is it a safe place for them to talk about, things that they've seen, experiences that they have had? Let's see here. Just making a point that home is the idea that it's an ideal place, lacks culture and trauma humility, but of course we all strive to create and sustain and advocate for a favorable, ideal home-like environment. Just has a privilege base, in my opinion. Thank you. So let's see. Oh, well, we've got some more. Let me see here.
Okay, I'm looking at one in the Q&A.
Okay.
Sue asks about resources for facilities to train their staff to look at the impacts of care delivery processes. We're used to picking up on the big traumas, rape, death of a spouse, etc. But she sees buildings completely miss the daily trauma of residents feeling ignored or not listened to. I'm going to refer you back to those resources in the slides, particularly the CMS, or sorry, not the CMS, the SAMHSA booklet, and which can be downloaded in its entirety, or there's a University of Buffalo Institute on Trauma-Informed Care implementation guide, and that takes you to a link where you sign up and they'll send it to you electronically. I think either of those would be useful in answering those questions. So hopefully that answers that question. Alexandria asks about, is CMS going to require long-term care homes to make referrals if a resident indicates they've experienced trauma, and explicitly asks for support that may require a licensed professional? I think that we don't know yet what CMS is going to require, but that makes the most sense to me, is that facilities in their assessment of their own capacity should know what their psychiatric resources are and where they're going to refer people for whom that becomes an issue.
And don't forget about your VOCA network in your community as an additional resource outside of the traditional older adult support network.
And Patricia, there was a comment in the chat feature that just popped up. Could you look at that and summarize the question and come up with an answer? And maybe Douglas, one of the two of you can respond to that. But I want to mention that Vicki wrote in that there has been some information on particularly flooding and relocation trauma, where she's read that residents that are relocated due to natural disaster unmet needs included an increase in need of oxygen, diabetic meds, anxiety meds, incontinence products. And so for anyone who relies on those kind of products, their needs are going to increase during trauma. So as an ombudsman, just, asking the home, the administration, how are you prepared not only to move the residents, but make sure that you've got you know, enough supplies to take with you, or, you know, those kind of probing questions, not in any other way than just an information way to, and or maybe to get them thinking that there's just certain, I mean, I don't know that right now there's any part of the country that's not safe from some kind of natural disaster. So just making sure that the home has a plan, and that they have shared that plan as much as possible with the residents and family and staff would be an appropriate role for the ombudsman. So Nancy, did you have some, Patricia, did you have some thought on this question from Patty?
Yeah, so Patty asked, what are the facilities required to do related to VOCA? And she essentially asked several questions about, you know, cultural competency and gender care. So, you know, VOCA is a federally funded program, and I don't know if states have discretion on how, you know, the criteria, how their VOCA services are to be constructed. So in Washington State, our VOCA training does talk about gender, LGBTQ issues, as well as welcoming communities and inclusivity and cultural competency. So for us at the Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program, we've purposefully sought out specific trainings from experts on the issues of LGBTQ. And, you know, it's an ever-learning process. And, but in terms of facilities required, what are they required to do related to VOCA? In our state, facilities aren't required to do anything related to VOCA, but I encourage you to look at your Victims of Crime Assistance Network, because you, at least for me, being a social worker in the aging field for over 25 years, I can't believe the types of services that are actually available for someone. And in our state, there's a look back period of 5 years. So someone who's been a victim of crime or have had a trauma experience, they could technically be eligible for services going back 5 years. So I don't know, Douglas, did you have anything you wanted to add to this question? Douglas isn't with me, so I'm not sure if he's able to access things appropriately, but that's all I have. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Amy mentioned that as a reminder that everything that's kind of been said about providing care or communicating with a resident, that it's important to explain to residents what your intentions are before completing them, whether it's a housekeeper sweeping the floor, an aide performing care, or even an ombudsman entering their room to visit with them. We never know what action we do can cause a reaction from a trauma-suffering resident, which doesn't mean we don't, you know, we become little mice and we're very timid. It just means that, again, every resident is so individualized that knocking, you know, learning how a person, being at their level, you know, all the stuff that ombudsmen have been trained to do in speaking to a resident is gonna probably 99% of the time work, and maybe even 100%, and it's gonna be that odd 101 that catches us up. But just being aware is probably more important than anything, to be watching for residents who suddenly become a different person. And why is that happening? I think is probably the most important thing. So Nancy, any last words at this point?
I think that this is just the beginning. I think that the explicit consideration of trauma in aging care is at its very beginnings. I think that a lot of the other models that we've looked at over the years have done some of the same things without the explicit addressing of trauma and past trauma symptoms. And I think that we're all going to be learning every day on how to do this moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Patricia.
Due to what Nancy said, I mean, we're learning, and we're learning about how trauma-informed advocacy exists within the long-term care ombudsman framework, because we have so many, laws and mandates already. How do we fit this in? For us, our next steps, we want to really look into resident aggression. And we also want to look into bullying between residents. These are violent acts that can happen every day in an individual manner in a care facility. And this, again, contributes to not feeling like you're safe and not feeling like you're in a secure home. So that's the next steps for us. We're just continuing to learn and discover new relationships and resources.
Well, I want to thank both of you for your assistance. Nancy, I'm sure there'll be some people who will be reaching out to you. And Patricia, I think the same. This is a maybe step one of a longer series of learning opportunities on the issue of trauma-informed care. And as CMS comes out with more guidance, and as we see state ombudsman programs or local programs investing in the area of training on trauma-informed care, we will continue to provide those resources to everyone. I want to thank everyone for being with us today. And again, a copy of this recording and the PowerPoints will be emailed out to you, and will be on the ltcombudsman.org website. When you get off this webinar, you will be asked to take a SurveyMonkey evaluation, just a minute or two. If you would take the time to give us feedback on this webinar, it will help inform us for future webinars. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.